The shooting range. In this episode, how to stay a decent human being under any circumstances, or the story of the Tu-2 bomber, the unkillable Churchill, how a very problematic tank made it to the Korean War, Hotline, the developers answer questions that you left in the comments. But first, let's start with the deadly duo. Let's fly the B-29 Superfortress and the Tupolev Tu-4. Just look at these two. Aren't they beautiful? It's no coincidence that we're going to talk about this exact pair. These two legendary bombers don't just look alike, they fly and play in pretty much the same fashion. Just keep in mind that the BR, the Soviet machine, is considerably higher, as its defensive armaments consist of cannons instead of machine guns, which allows it to fight jets actually. To be fair, that also makes the Tu-4 a tougher pick. It fights deadlier opponents, the starting bombs are way too small, and it takes a lot of time to get better ones. The best way to upgrade both of these bombers is pretty straightforward. Get as high as you can, and then bomb the heck out of enemy bases and airfields. Despite the respectable armor and all the defenses, a low-flying B-29 is a welcoming sight to any enemy fighter, and the Tu-4 is simply doomed. So, get up in there. There are two main things to remember. First, fight the urge to fly to the nearest target with all your bomber buddies. Hit several targets at the same time. Coordinate your efforts in the chat, or just see where the other bombers go and then pick a target for yourself. Second, do not open fire until the enemy is in the palm of your hand. Wait till they get to the distance of about 1 to 1.5 kilometers, and only then turn them into flaming cheese graters. And practice, practice, practice. If you want to fly these majestic beasts, you have to be better at shooting down enemy planes than any veteran Petrovich. Also, it pays to get your timing right. Don't forget that it takes some time to open your bombing hatch. Take this into account, or it will ruin your bombing run. If you're forced to hunt smaller ground targets, which we do not recommend doing, please pay attention to your altitude. Nothing is more infuriating than getting blown up by your own high-explosive bomb. Every type has its own effective fragmentation radius, please take this into account. And one more thing, the B-29 and the Tu-4 are great picks for the aircraft RB, but it's not a good idea to take them into mixed battles. It is a real pain in the butt to hunt moving targets on these strategic bomber aircraft, unsurprisingly, and the enemy AA guns will have a field day shooting at such a slow and bulky target. Good hunting. Next up is the second part of the story of the British Churchill, or how it survived all the efforts to sweep it under the rug. The first two versions of the Churchill, Mark I and Mark II, were created in 1941 and instantly became outdated. They had great armor, but the two-powder cannon couldn't even leave a scratch on the newest German machines like the Panzer III and the Panzer IV with their 50mm front armor. And even the older German tanks became a problem as they were routinely fortified with additional armor plates, which meant that the British gun had to penetrate 60mm of steel, so the two-powder had to go. That wasn't the only problem with the early Churchills. They weren't exactly reliable or fast. Having spent some time fighting in the desert, the British realized that they needed a completely different machine. The Royal Army wanted an agile and multi-purpose heavy tank, preferably with a 75mm main gun, and with some explosive shells, please. So basically, they wanted to create a British Sherman. And so the military proposed to assemble heavy A-33 Excelsiors instead of the poor Churchill and rearrange the resources to boost the production of new medium tanks like the Centaur and the Cromwell. At some point, there was even a plan to use a few American factories to produce a line of the heavy T-14s for the Royal Army. But the Churchill wasn't going to go down this easily. In March of 1942, there was a new modification of the tank, the Mark III. It had a brand new welded turret and a 57mm gun that could penetrate the armor of any German tank. Right after that, the British created the Churchill Mark IV with a cast turret. The new tanks weren't just deadlier, the engineers also got rid of a bunch of construction flaws that plagued the early modifications. For example, they reworked air intakes for the cooling system could block a lot more dust now. The Mark III and the Mark IV performed really well in battle, so the Army agreed to continue the production and the development of the Churchills. It's worth noting that at the point, the British didn't yet embrace the one-tank-do-all approach. The Mark III and the Mark IV were outfitted with 6-pounders and were meant to fire only armor-piercing shells, and only at enemy vehicles. The high-explosive munitions and smoke shells were the prerogative of the Churchill Mark V, which had a 95mm howitzer for a main gun. But then, the British got to drive the American Shermans that had a 75mm gun that was capable of both penetrating armored targets and firing high-explosive rounds at infantry. The British tankers loved it so much that they salvaged these guns with its mantlets from damaged Shermans and installed them on their Churchill Mark IVs right in the field. Closer to the end of the war, the latest modification of the tank was the magnificent Mark VII. It boasted a new body and a turret that had up to 152mm of armor in the front. It also got an upgraded suspension and a reworked transmission. And instead of the 6-pounder, the Mark VII came equipped with a British 75mm gun that was perfectly compatible with the American shells. So, is this a happy ever after type of story? Well, no. Sure, the Army finally got a reliable tank with decent armor and a good multi-purpose cannon. It outlived the American T-14s and the British A-33 Excelsiors. Remember those guys? The very same that were supposed to bury the Churchill. But the 75mm gun couldn't cope with the new German Tigers and Panthers, and the frame of the tank didn't allow for the installation of bigger guns. It didn't stop the Churchill from fighting in the Korean War though. And only then, this heavy tank finally went to its long rest. And now let's talk about the phenomenon of designing aircraft in prison. In the late 1930s, at the peak of the Stalinist purges, the Bolsheviks needed a new bomber that could replace the outdated Tupolev SB. And who a better man for the job than Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev himself? And what a lucky coincidence, he was right here, within the reach of a hand, locked inside the Gulag prison with almost all his crew and brilliant minds like Polikarpov and Mshishev. How convenient! Now these engineers could earn their way out by creating this new bomber. The authorities didn't ask for much after all. It just had to be an awesome multi-purpose aircraft that could serve as a high-speed bomber, a dive bomber, a reconnaissance plane, and let's see, maybe a heavy fighter. No big deal. The one who invents it walks out a free man. We're not joking, by the way. That was exactly the task the prisoners were given, and it was already scaled down. The first version had already been swept under the rug because even the party had deemed it impossible. Polikarpov and Mshishev presented their projects rather quickly and were soon released. But Tupolev was destined to spend a couple of years working in the Prison Construction Bureau. His plane, the Aircraft 103, that later became the famous Tupolev Tu-4, was the most ambitious of the three projects, but also the one with the most problems. It got into the air only at the beginning of 1941. Around this time, Tupolev was released as well. But there was a twist. He didn't get to return to his work at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. Instead, he was sent 2,000 kilometers away to the city of Omsk to supervise the production of his new plane. The Tu-2 still had lots of problems. The chassis wasn't working properly, there were some troubles with the power plant, and a few test pilots perished while flying it. In the end, only a small batch of these planes made it to the front line. The Tu-2 quickly became very popular with the pilots though, but it wasn't enough to keep up the production going. The party decided to close the project and repurpose the factory to build fighter planes. This could mean the end of Tupolev's career as an aircraft designer. And what could he do? Desperate for options, he did everything he could to persuade the party to leave the final evaluation of this project to a special commission. This request reached the ears of Stalin himself. The father of nations agreed, but decided to appoint the head of the new commission himself. Stalin went with another famous aircraft designer, Nikolai Nikolaevich Polikarpov. Tupolev was terrified. They knew each other for many years, and their relationship was turbulent at best. They had their first fight even before the revolution. At that time, it cost Tupolev his job. In the mid-1920s, they were arguing bitterly over a lot of things, and Tupolev lost quite a few of these arguments, some in front of their superiors, the top members of the Bolshevik Party. Polikarpov wanted to build fighters. Tupolev was a bomber type of guy. The former was reluctant to build all-metal aircraft. The latter was obsessed with them, this kind of thing. To make matters worse, Polikarpov remained a religious person and had balls to wear a baptismal cross in the open, which really pissed a lot of people off. Naturally, he was constantly being reported upon. In 1929, he was arrested and even sentenced to death. It took a miracle of sorts to set him free. He got out by designing the famous Polikarpov I-5 from inside his prison cell. After that, on the verge of another arrest, he created a whole range of legendary Soviet planes, including the multi-purpose Polikarpov R-5, the Po-2 trainer aircraft, and the famous Polikarpov I-16 fighter. Through this work, he earned the sympathy and respect of Stalin himself. Smooth sailing from there on, right? One would think that after the arrest of Tupolev and a lot of his associates, there would be no more problems for Polikarpov. Well, there were still a lot of other people who would love to see him fall. And so some of his projects were taken from him and handed over to other designers, and some of his other projects were shut down permanently. A devout Christian and a true patriot, Polikarpov was devastated. This kind of injustice took a heavy toll on him. By the time he became the head of the Special Commission, he was in constant pain. The diagnosis wasn't clear at the time, but everybody knew that Polikarpov was at death's door. Horror-struck, Tupolev realized that this appointment was a gift from Stalin to Polikarpov, a way to enact vengeance after all. Tupolev was the man responsible for a lot of Polikarpov's troubles, and now it was all down to Polikarpov. Had he approved the project, Tupolev would have been saved. He'd have got his life back, an apartment in Moscow, a personal car, all the awards, decorations, money, and fame. He could finally meet his wife and son, who were living in hunger thousands of kilometers away from him. But if Polikarpov had said that the plane was nothing but a waste of national funds, Tupolev would have been just as dead as Polikarpov himself. He'd had been arrested already, this time with a death sentence coming his way, and his relatives would have been forever considered a family of a traitor. Moreover, Polikarpov was developing his own multi-purpose bomber at the time. They were rivals once again. There was no way the disgraced aircraft designer could get away. But even at death's door, Polikarpov didn't let revenge get the best of him. On the contrary, after some careful examination, he praised the design and demanded that the production of the Tu-2 should be immediately reopened. That wasn't all. He also suggested a few ways Tupolev could get rid of the existing flaws and make the design simpler and more efficient. The renewed Tu-2 went into mass production and basically became the best Soviet multi-purpose two-engine bomber ever created. Nikolai Nikolaevich Polikarpov returned to Moscow and died of cancer on the 30th of July 1944, despite the doctor's efforts. He was only 52 years old. Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev lived to a great age and became a legend of aviation by creating a long list of machines that surprise us even to this day. But sometimes people saw him alone, sitting at the grave of Polikarpov, the man he hated for many years, the man who had turned out to be his real friend, his savior, and a decent human being till the very end. Get ready for the traditional last part of our show, Hotline, developers answering questions from the comments. Strictly speaking, it's not the most serious-minded section of the show. If you want answers to be given with solemn faces, feel free to appeal to the official War Thunder forums. Here we have a more lighthearted discussion of the big questions of War Thunder. The first question, or rather a set of questions, comes from a player called Pekan Igenmaster. Will the bomber cockpits be finished? Will you implement a free-for-all game mode to the game? Will you add more Japanese jets? Are there any Easter eggs in the game? Hey buddy, yes, cockpits will be finished, no doubt about that. No, we do not plan to make a game mode like this, but you can find a lot of custom missions of this sort at live.warthunder.com. We are still working on the Japanese, yes, and there are quite a few Easter eggs in our game, and we're proud of them. Vlad Midden writes, I've noticed a few errors in the French version of the game. Where can I rectify these errors? Hey Vlad, please submit a bug report or official forums. We take matters like this very seriously, and hats off to you for wanting to help us make the game better. Trevino Wheeler asks, can smoke rounds kill other tanks or shoot down planes? Yeah, it can be done. It's far from easy though. And the last, very important message says, Deus Vult.
Deus vult, non nobis, Domini, non nobis, sed nomini tuo daclo.
Wait, what? That's it for today, but feel free to write your questions in the comments below. We do read them all, and you might see some of them answered in the next episode. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you on the shooting range.